Yeah, I was watching David Gleam's dog joined him in our faculty meeting yesterday. That was kind of fun. Right, so organizations. I'll wrap up my kind of broad discussion of organizations today, and then Joelle will take over and talk about the specific case of Arthur Andersen, which I think is a good example of some of the real points we want to address here. And again, I think I gave you a bit of this spiel last time, but again, in terms of like practical stuff to do with the sociology of culture. In terms of making money and getting a job, the organizational studies stuff, is really a big part of that, right? So, I think I mentioned, in business schools, they always keep a cultural sociologist kind of on hand to talk about the culture in organizations, or how cultures or how organizations relate to their surrounding culture. A lot of studies on that stuff. So of course you can use sociology and culture for a lot of applications for various different things, but this seems to be one that is very directly, I guess, will make you a lot of money. And if you go on for an MBA, you're going to hear material kind of like this again. Or if you do management or marketing or market research, right? That's very clearly a lot about culture. How can you use culture to fool people into wanting things they don't want or need? Yes. Okay. So I think we got through last time this kind of point about how you can use culture to motivate workers. There are structural things you can do, like flattening the organizational structure, or more pointedly, you can choose people for a job, or I don't know if any of your dads work at one of these kind of places that like are really all in on dads or moms work in one of these places that are like all in on the company culture, and they throw picnics. And IBM even had like a songbook for a while where it's like, hey, like we're a family here at Initech Industries and blah 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 blah. That's certainly a way to motivate people, to get them to do their job that organizations, not all organizations certainly, but many organizations focus on. We also want to talk about, so change my view here. Is that going to work? It's not going to work. There we go. The different cultures that come in to an organization. And again, this speaks to the idea that an organization exists within a cultural environment. So on the one hand, and that suggests a variety of things, obviously, but on the one hand, what that suggests is, and this is kind of a classic structural functionalist or systems theory metaphor of organizations or of any kind of a business or governmental structure. You say, well, it's got a border around it that basically includes the bureaucracy, includes its culture, includes the people in it. But obviously, right, people come from outside the organization into the organization, And the point with that being, those people have cultures of their own. So the organization is, to some extent limited in the ability and the flexibility that they have to make workers or make members of the organization be the kind of people that they want to be, because those people come in with preconceived notions of what work is, or what an organization is, or what's important to them in their life. And also, of course, we know from some of our other studies that we've been talking about, people with different culture come into the same organization. So this is part of the division between workers and management to some extent, is that some portion of the workers, certainly come from the working class. A number of people in management. It's not to say there isn't some mobility in our society, but actually there's not as much as there used to be. And we know that managers tend to come from the middle class, from the upper middle class, and have a somewhat different culture than the working class folks in an organization, right? And so that is a potential avenue for friction, recipe for, I don't want to say disaster, but recipe for problems that an organization has to negotiate. And we'll see also today sometimes predicated on this notion that people from outside the environment or outside the organization come in and bring in their own culture. They may form subculture within the organization, or relatively similar people with different locations in the organization will form subcultures of their own. I think we maybe had a little bit of a window into this in that video games article, right? And so, like you would think the people who do graphic work versus the programmers, right? They're going to be very different kinds of people. They're going to have different work cultures, and you can even, and really with any fairly decent sized organization, you have to think about this, and this is something especially if you're a manager, you have to consider, right? So even at Eckerd, that BES professors are going to be different than creative arts type people. There's obviously a certain amount of commonality there, but certainly there are differences as well that managers have to negotiate. What else do we have to look at? I also would point right to the other ways of relating the organization to the environment, and that has especially focused in recent years on the national culture. So rather than focusing now on the internal culture, this is sort of a focus on the relationship between the organization and its environment. And what, again, a lot of that has been focused on the national culture. So, and that's, it's culture, it's structure too, though. So if you think, about a global corporation, and this is often the context that this really comes up in is, a global corporation. Griswold liked to use McDonald's, right? They have to adapt to the culture in the nation that they're trying to do business in. So a McDonald's in Beijing is going to be different than a McDonald's in name a suburb, Tampa, wherever. Any American city is going to be different than a McDonald's in Tel Aviv, right? So that's just to say, an organization, especially from a marketing standpoint, has to be aware of the national culture. But again, this speaks to issues of what comes into the organization. So Friday, we'll talk about how Israelis and I want to say Jordanians working in the same organization had very different relationships to work and to the organization. Right? So again, always focusing on those exchanges across the boundaries. And what that means, in part is what's an acceptable product. The classic case that Griswold highlights was the Chevy Nova, which had to be renamed in the Latin American markets. I think this might be an apocryphal story, but anyway, the story goes the Nova had to be renamed in Latin American markets. It wasn't selling there because in Spanish, Nova means it doesn't go, right? It's a car that doesn't go. So they had to rename it. Again, might not really be a true story. And here is again where I want to say this is a little bit of a space where culture and structure really kind of intertwine in terms of what acceptable business practices are there. And I should say, I'm mostly focusing on profit-earning firms here, but again, this really does apply to non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, et cetera, any kind of organization that's doing business across borders. And in terms of business practice, what comes to mind for me right away is how you deal with corruption. And again, corruption is somewhat of a structural feature of a system, right? A bureaucracy that's not really, or a government or a democracy that's not really fully functioning, leaves, what I would call, structural spaces for actors to engage in corrupt behaviors. So this is something like if you're in Mexico and you want to build a plant to make, I don't know, car stereos or something like that, and you want to hook up to the town sewer line or something like that. In America, well, not everywhere. There are corrupt places in America, but generally speaking, in America, you just you pay for the right permits down at City Hall. You pay the right contractors, and everything goes smoothly. You get your sewer line. In Mexico and other more corrupt places, you have to know that, again, it's sort of a structural thing, sort of a cultural thing. You have to pay somebody off in order to get business done. So you may have to buy the permits at City Hall, but still, in order for anybody to actually approve the project, you've got to pay, local official X some amount of money. That's actually illegal for American businesses to do, but we know that they do it all the time. There are laws that say American businesses can't engage in corruption or engage with corruption in foreign business practices, but it happens all the time because that's the culture of a lot of places. That is the expected business practice in certain places. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be something negative like that. This also goes to examples like, taking somebody's business card, the way you deal with that in Japan, or, the drinking culture is different in different places, right? So like Japanese businessmen, may want you to spend long nights drinking and spending lots of money in order to seal deals. That's different than most American business cultures, but you have to adapt. You have to be ready for that. Again, these are things that specifically like Professor Jaskowski talks about in his international business courses. Okay, other things. I would say, just from a historical standpoint, be aware of what we call new institutionalism. Which is just generally, the way I think about it is just generally this turn towards culture in organizational studies. A turn away from just studying the structural arrangements of firms, or just thinking of people in firms as rational actors, but really thinking of them as people who come with culture, think about how the culture or how the organization functions within a cultural context. And one of the a couple of the insights there. Structures influence culture. We've already seen a little bit of this in terms of the motivation question in organizations. So this idea of flattening the organization. So, instead of having the organization with a bunch of different levels of management, if you say everybody's a manager and everybody's a worker, something like that, only have a couple of people who are higher up managers, or call them team leaders, but also make it so that any worker on any team can access the big boss. That's flattening the structure. And the hope there is that this leads to more open communication, and in particular to innovation. Because anybody could have a good idea, and if they don't have to proceed through 12 levels of management to get to a boss who can approve an interesting new project, then that person's idea will be more likely to proceed and to succeed, right? So that's why, especially organizations that depend on creativity like Google, try to flatten out the organization. And again, the thought there is that if you change the structure, then you change the culture in the organization and the ideas that are produced within the organization. The other big one, well, I think that's probably speaks enough to that. She gives the example of what the Vatican right? In the Vatican reform, reformers used the structure of the Vatican to get their agenda across, right? And savvy people will know how to navigate a structure to obtain their cultural goals, shall we say. And also the new institutionalism gives us this idea of what we call isomorphism, which is just generally the tendency of organizations to look similar to each other. And this really, there's a few reasons for this. What I mean by looking similar to each other, obviously my experience is largely within the higher education sector. So when we're talking about colleges, and when this college, in particular, or any college really, is talking about well, what new projects do we want? What majors should we have? What should the cafeterias look like? What should the dorms look like? How should the Title IX office be structured? They tend not to invent those whole cloth, but rather they look around throughout the industry. If we want to think of higher education as an industry, you look around throughout the industry and you just you do what the other guys are doing, or hopefully you do what the successful guys are doing. So there's just that kind of looking over your back, copycatting that goes on. There are also, though, more generally, structures will just tend to look the same because they operate in the same cultural and structural environment. So something like the Title IX office, that's demanded by the way that the Department of Education has structured things, right? So, it's almost like the organization has to be like that. And also, of course, within organizational sectors, people are moving around. So my expectations of how things should be done at a college are predicated on, my experience on the couple of other colleges that, I've gone to or taught at, that kind of a thing. And that's going to be, throughout different industries. If you move from Oracle to Hewlett Packard to Dell, you're going to expect certain things based on your prior experiences, and so there will be overall a tendency for organizations to end up looking like each other, right? And sometimes that's under the rubric of best practices, but often it's just under the rubric of that's just how we do it. Okay, I think we've talked enough about the multicultural environment stuff. Again, in Griswold's rubric, it's probably useful to think about products as cultural objects, right? So the Big Mac as a cultural object, and she has that. Did I bring the book? Thought I brought the book. Yeah, I brought the book. So where are we at? Chapter 6 here, 5. Where are we? Who am I? Chapter 6. Where did it go? Right. Oh boy, kind of ugly. It's actually not exactly. Sorry, not exactly what it's a little more complicated than I wanted it to be. But you can see again, whatever page that is, 119, if you're following along at home. But the point there is we can use this kind of analysis. If you look at the top of the chart here, the idea is you've got two different social worlds that you have to pay attention to, right? So in this case, right, the social world is, that's sort of the global culture of loving American products, right? McDonald's, I'm loving it, ba-da-ba-ba. And that's one social world, but that then comes up against, either the particular Israeli youth culture is what she highlights here, or one could certainly highlight the culture. The social world of the Orthodox Jewish religious community when you talk about bringing a cheeseburger to Israel. Because I don't know, do you know? None of you are Jews, right? So you don't know what kosher rules are. A cheeseburger is by nature not kosher because you're not supposed to. This is in Leviticus, right? You're not supposed to bathe the lamb in the milk of its mother. Which just all that generally means actually there are certain times we do that, right? You can't eat Wiener Schnitzel in the proper way. You can't bathe the meat in dairy before breading it. But anyway, lasagna, yes, right. You'd have to have vegetarian lasagna, exactly. Because the interpretation is generally cheese plus meat does not go together, right? And McDonald's has to be aware of that. Of course, in Gentile culture, global culture, or secular Jewish culture, doesn't matter. But when you come into a place that has religious authorities like that, it very much matters, right? And so McDonald's has to be hyper aware of that. Okay, I think that pretty well covers what I think is the important stuff. And again, though, for the next few days, next week or so, how many of these did we do? Right, so we've got Hallett today, and then Mizrachi on Friday, and then Rivera, right? So cultural matching. That'll really speak to the what I was talking about earlier in terms of how do you bring the outside culture into the organization in terms of people being possessors of pre-existing culture. And so today, the Hallett material is really, it's partly about that, right? Partly about the culture that comes in, but also is very much about how internal cultures develop within organizations. And there's a little bit on habitus and stuff, but I'm excited to see where Joelle takes us with that. So I don't want to say too much. So I'll just let you have the virtual floor, as it were.
Thanks for that pressure.
No pressure, no pressure.
Let me see. Can you see this? Can you see this? Wait, hold on. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me go back to the front. Okay, so obviously I'm doing symbolic power in organizational culture. I did mine like a little short because you told me that I wasn't gonna have enough time to do it, but it should be fine. So this is by Tim Hallett. And so basically this article talks about, I mean, you guys read it obviously, but it talks about Arthur Andersen and company. And so these are just like a couple little things about it, because at first I had no idea what they actually did because it like had all the legal talk, so I had to like really research it. But basically, Arthur Andersen and company, they were convicted of obstruction of justice because after like the culture switch that we'll get into later, they were really heavily client focused. And so what they did was they like shredded documentation for this company called Enron, and they like hid a lot of the money that was coming in, they were losing. They hid a lot of that money, and so they didn't get convicted of like fraud, but because they hid the documentation and shredded the documents, they were convicted of obstruction of justice. And the Supreme Court actually reversed that conviction, but because of like the whole scandal and like everything that happened in the public, they like lost all their credibility and no one trusted the public institutions or like these organizations after this. And so they were in operation from 1913 to 2002. And if you look at my little meme, this is from SpongeBob. I made it myself because their company died. And then so the thing that he's talking about in this article is the symbolic power model, and his definition in the article was like 3 paragraphs long. So I tried to go find a little shorter one, and I found it from Stuart Hall. And it's symbolic power is the way in which exhibition construction persuades meaning through demonstration. So through demonstrating a path through meaning. So it's inevitable and it's located around the author. He calls it the negotiator, but so it's therefore under individual control. And so he says there's 5 features of symbolic power. Um, and they're in like the last 2 or 3 pages that he really stresses exactly what they mean. But he says that the first is stressing practice and interaction. So the practice of what they're doing, and how they're interacting with each other. And then integration and conflict, how the cultures are mixing together and or conflicting with each other, stability and change, causal efficiency, and then multiple levels of analysis. What he says in the article, I think, is that it gives the negotiator or the person looking at it the ability to glide through multiple levels of analysis. And then so he says that there's 3 lenses to look at this cultural situation, and this is also my meme because their company culture was trash. Um, and so he says there's 3 lenses, and these are the 3 lenses that he looks at them through. So he looks first at the subjective beliefs and values. So those are the beliefs and values held in common by individuals. So the company has all these employees and people looking at them, the beliefs and values that they hold. And we'll talk about it a little later, but the first CEO or whatever owner, Arthur Andersen, he was like really integrity focused. So that's what the company had, because most of the individuals that he hired and that he started with were people like that. So that's what the beginning of the company was like. And then he also looks at context and public meaning, which is culture as context exists in public and functions to articulate meaning. So he uses, or the people in the company use their culture, and what's going on in the office to articulate what they're doing in their work and how the company should act. And then the symbolic power, obviously what I said earlier, stresses the existence of culture, and the focus is placed on observable practices and interactions. And it temporarily brackets meaning to observe how audiences value certain practices, and negotiate legitimacy. And then the negotiators use that legitimacy to define the situation. And then a little bit about the Andersen's actual culture. So he says that it's like, I don't really know why the person that said this used these specific titles, but so he says samurai culture is auditing and tax, like the auditing and tax services side of the company, represented samurai culture, which is like integrity, honor, and moral codes, which is like what the original person Arthur Andersen um upheld. And then the merchant culture is like the consulting and business side of the company, which only valued profit, and they were like manipulative and anything goes as long as they can get money. So those are like the two cultures that were in conflict within this specific company. So these are like some examples of where you can really see that the culture is in conflict. So at first, this is a quote from Arthur Andersen, and he says, "There's not enough money in the city of Chicago to induce me to change my report." That is, I can't type apparently, but anyway. And so this is a really good example of samurai culture, because not only did he refused to take any money to, change his moral code, he actually lost his client. So he lost money to try to stick to his moral code. And it says in the thing that he was raised like really strictly Scandinavian. I don't really know about Scandinavian culture, but apparently this is something they think, which is think straight, talk straight. I didn't really know what that meant, but if you guys know what that means, then that's what he said. And then this is an example of the merchant culture. So in the article, it tells a story about this guy named Bell, and he was basically not doing exactly what Enron wanted. So not hiding the fact that they were losing money, and they didn't like that he wasn't a little puppet. So Enron asked Anderson and Co. to fire him, and this is after the culture change. So this is after they went from samurai to merchant. And when they were in this merchant culture, they decided to fire Bell. And so they were essentially choosing the customer happiness or money over their employee. And their employee was actually accurate in his suspicion. So if they would have just listened to him, then in the end, they would have continued making money. So it's kind of ironic. And then this is like the complete shift in culture that they went to. So Arthur Andersen was like a samurai. He was stern, strict, and Scandinavian, I guess. And then I wasn't really sure which one caused it, because it talked about Larry taking over the company. But then they like stopped talking about him, and then they said Mizell was the one that like really started like the merchant culture. So I just put slash because I didn't really know which one was the negotiator. But these people or person was the one that changed the culture to like this merchant market manipulation money kind of culture. And then the consequences of this shifting that happened were a loss of employment. So not only did after the scandal, a lot of people lose their jobs. I think it said like 30,000, 45,000. Like a lot of people lost their jobs. But also people before the scandal, they were doing like forced retirements of people who still were in the samurai culture, or like budget cuts, or like they were oppressing that culture. Like for example, Bell, he was having that old samurai culture, so they're like, nah, fam, you gotta go. And then in the lost credibility, or another consequence is lost credibility of as external auditors. So part of it, Anderson and Co. sent their employees to work at Enron, and so essentially they were auditing themselves. So if the Enron company looked like they were losing money and weren't doing very good, then their own employees looked bad. So this was another portion into why they started losing that samurai and integrity thing, because you always want to save yourself, of course. And then another consequence kinda is like their profit over anything. So this idea that they really needed to make money over everything and they need to get richer and richer led the company to falsify the balance sheets and the losses, which leaded them to their own demise. And then one that I thought was interesting is like it talked about like the large scale effects of this consequence. And so obviously was unemployment. A ton of people lost their jobs, and then also there was like a big stock market loss, so a lot of people lost money. And then also there was a decline in trust of corporations. I wasn't sure if it was only because of this. I'm not sure how large scale this specific event was. But I know that there was a huge decline in public trust of corporations, and then this also called for like a corporate reform bill. So this national culture and large scale change of public trust and like corporate reform is another consequence that has happened of it. I wouldn't say a consequence, maybe a consequence for the people that are trying to scam people, but I guess it's a gain for people who don't want to be scammed. Yeah. And so some key takeaways from this is that the culture within organizations directly impacts job performance and organizational pursuits. So like the culture changed and their pursuit changed. At first it was they're trying to, remain integritable. They're trying to remain their integrity, keep their integrity, and just do their job well and make their earnest money, whatever they made. And then once that changed, they became greedy and they did anything for that money. And then also the symbolic power can be utilized by a single person, but that single person has to have like the perfect skills. So he says in the article that people like that are really, really rare, and they have to like all 5 points have to come together at the perfect moment for them to be able to really change the culture. But symbolic power also empowers the individuals. So even the people that aren't that negotiator with those crazy skills, they're also given power, maybe not traditional power, but by imbuing legitimacy to the negotiator, they can also use symbolic power. And so there's this little diagram thing that he uses to kind of show this. So like the first person here would be like the employee or the multiple employees that gives legitimacy to the negotiator, and then that negotiator uses his negotiation power and symbolic power to change the culture of the organization. And then my last key takeaway is that capitalism breeds cowards, because obviously. Um, and then, so these are some discussion questions. I don't know if I can switch back and see your guys' faces while I'm doing this, but can you think of any notable person who's drastically changed an organization's culture? The first person that I was thinking about, not necessarily an organization, but like Donald Trump. He came in and had like the perfect sales pitch to America and completely changed America's culture in regards to like racial tensions and things like that. So I was thinking if you guys can think of any other people who've done that, or even if you want to talk about Trump.
I mean, I definitely agree, Trump. Like, I wrote something about the government. It's added. It was towards him in one of my discussion questions for today. So, like, that's like kind of the big person that comes to mind.
Yeah. And then when I was thinking of that, I was thinking like of Eckerd culture, and lately they've been saying like that Eckerd's culture is so terrible, and like the sexual assault cases and like all of the lawsuits that are going on. I was wondering what you guys think Eckerd's culture is, and what you think if you think the new president of Eckerd will change the culture, and like what do you think it might be afterward, or what you think the people of Eckerd that are pushing for this new culture change want that new culture to be. Like, what would you say Eckerd's culture is now? Because like you used to say like keep Eckerd weird. It's not really weird anymore. So
yeah,
I would say for Eckerd. Oh, okay. For Eckerd, I would say it's the culture. They want to be more inclusive. That's definitely one thing, and I feel like the new president might go a little bit forward with that. And also on the I think it's Title IX policy. I know that's been like really controversial around Eckerd recently, and I'm guessing that he's probably going to do something about that. Because there's definitely needs to be change. But that's all I have.
Well, the president didn't. Oh, sorry. But I was just going to say the president didn't doesn't have to be the one to the change though. Like the students can be the change, just like the Title IX board that's like students now, which is really cool. And I think that he could help implement change, but I think he's just like the figurehead of it, and that like the students are the actual like movement.
Yeah.
I think that agriculture has, because like, I don't know what agriculture is going to be in a year. Frankly, I don't really give a shit because I'm graduating. Like, I'm never going back to Eckerd except to move out. Like, whenever that happens. But like, the difference between when I was a freshman and like this year is insane. Like, when I was a freshman, people didn't go around writing racial slurs on people's cars. Like, people didn't like destroy cultural like things. Like, what was it like? Was it Cinco de Mayo or was it? Was it the Dead? I think like people are just destroying other people's cultures on campus and like being really freaking racist, and it's insane. Like, I don't understand where it's coming from. Like,
Trump?
I don't like. I guess it might be the new people that are coming in, but like I don't know because I don't associate with anyone.
Yeah, I've seen people write like bad words on cars and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that could be like the trickle down from Trump changing the nationwide culture.
That's what I was thinking too. That like his presidency has like given people this horrible confidence to like say what's, you know, in the back of their heads that they know is inappropriate or, you know, like moral. But you know, they think they have this like certain power because he's in power.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So then my third one is, do you think understanding symbolic power can help push forward social movements? So like how he says, people imbue negotiators with legitimacy and symbolic power, and then when facing detrimental situations, people can and do stop imbuing negotiators with symbolic power. So like if we're understanding symbolic power, could we, you know, essentially, this is a huge scale example, but like people like Donald Trump, if we stop imbuing negotiators with that symbolic power because people realize that it's a detrimental situation, would that put an end to that? Like, for example, Donald Trump in no way at all should be president, but people are giving him this legitimacy and symbolic power by voting or by, you know, keeping that culture alive. So do you think understanding symbolic power would help move these social movements forward, or, you know, stopping social movements at all? Like on the small scale, would they help?
I think, yeah, because like in the case of Donald Trump, like since he's been president, a lot of social movements have stopped and have even like gone backwards. Like now we're seeing abortion being banned and like bunch of there's so many things.
We
Like
did have the Me Too movement though. The Me Too movement happened, which is like a, you know, good one that came out of it, like people coming against like what he's saying, but I get what Mary's saying too. Also, it's regressed. So.
The Me Too movement is like a good example too. Like, who's that? Like, I don't. Is it Harvey Weinstein? I don't know what their names is. Like the really that was like
director.
Yeah, who was like crazy in power, and no one would say anything against him. So people stopped imbuing him with that legitimacy, and everyone was like, "Yeah, no, this guy's an asshole." Then it put an end to him. So
and he got corona.
Whatever. Yeah, that's the end of my questions. So I don't have anything else.
Yeah, that was really awesome. Thank you. Those are good and yeah, I guess what was it, timely questions, right? Yeah, especially, I mean, I would say, you know, even for a senior, you should pay attention to and do what you can to influence your alma mater, because A, you're in a position to do that, as alumni of the institution, but B, it sticks with you, right? So like, there is the reputation of Eckerd. Eckerd will always be that diploma that you carry around. And the worst case scenario, of course, is like, if you go to a college that shuts down, that's bad. But if Eckerd gets, that's not going to happen at Eckerd, right? That's in the near future anyway. That's not going to happen. But that has happened at places like, I forget the name of the librarian, Professor Johnson. Her old college just shut down, right? Because they couldn't attract enough students anymore. But the reputation of a place matters, right? If no, your degree still counts. It's still okay. Yes. The reputation matters. If Eckerd, continued to trend towards having this reputation of just like douchey, racist, rich kids, then you don't really want to be associated with that. And alumni really can do things to nudge, right? They have a whole department here, the development department and the alumni relations, to pay attention to, what alumni have to say, so that, you don't, you're welcome to cut ties, but you don't have to.
That's very true. I'm just really pissed off at the situation, though, that we're in.
Yeah. Understandably so. And yeah, great. Great points on Trump. And interestingly though, and I think, because this is a cultural theory paper, Hallett doesn't push the structural side too much. But remember, I think it's a really great couple of dudes who you brought up. Between Weinstein and Trump, and I think, it's interesting. I don't know. It's still kind of amazing that, to me, whatever, that Trump does have as much symbolic power attributed to him, despite his deep flaws, let's say. I think there's still, I think he keeps losing that as time goes on, though. And I think a lot of people were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, even in the news media, but increasingly the news media, says things like, you can't trust a word that Donald Trump says. They don't say it in as many words, but when they're like analyzing, his latest, whatever these coronavirus shit shows that he puts on are, they're like, he says this, but nobody knows, as you as an informed reader should know, he often doesn't stand by his word, so that's I think a continued loss of symbolic power there. But Hallett addresses this a little bit, but could address more the fact that power is also a structural thing, right? So there's a huge array of structures, of which Trump is largely ignorant, that put him in the power, that give him the power that he has, right? So his power is not merely symbolic; it is also structural. So he, it is really interesting, to see the kinds of things that he does or doesn't or can or can't do. And obviously, we're in this really fucked up time. You can see this, invoking, the various sort of Defense Production Act clauses that he chooses to use or not. So the president can literally tell businesses you have to make ventilators now, or you have to make masks, and that's a power that Congress has given him, as opposed to what's building up into a fight now is this thing over the WHO. He doesn't really have the power to tell the WHO that he's not going to give them money because Congress apportioned that money to the WHO. So, you know, as with the business with Ukraine last year, you know, part of the problem, and, you know, ultimately they did give the money to the Ukraine because he doesn't have that power. So there are structural powers that you do or don't have. And certainly that's true to some extent within any organization. But Weinstein really is a great example. And like you were saying, like people just continued to give power to this guy, to ignore, you know, his, you know, committing egregious assaults on people because they're like, I don't even know, I guess because the guy was a hit maker, right? The guy financed, you know, a long string of really great, really profitable films, and he also cultivated this kind of a larger than life persona around him. And so, yeah, I mean, just you know, as way of saying, like, yeah, he's a great example of symbolic power because, you know, there's not much structural to his power, you know, perhaps beyond the actual cash that he has access to. Just a couple of other things. You mentioned well, maybe your second or third to last slide, you know, questioning how big an effect the death of Andersen had on people's trust in corporations. And it's, you know, it's all now, it's 18 years back, but you know, interestingly, the name Andersen doesn't tend to come up as much in these discussions, but you know, it's put under the rubric of the Enron scandal, and that really did have a lot of cultural currency. You know, was constantly mentioned in like the 2004 presidential elections. You know, has been something that people keep going back to as, you know, one of these real examples of how corporations think they can or could get away with anything. And so it was a real watershed moment in, yeah, I guess I don't know what you'd call it, American political history, American corporate history. You know, it's interesting, though, that it really has been projected as Enron's issue. Oh, then, man, they were such shitbags because they would do things like they were such a weird company. They were basically an energy holding company, and they would buy energy from one place and send it to other places, which I don't even really know quite how that works. But they would do things like mess with California and not send California enough electricity, and so there would be like brownouts, so that they could try to drive up the cost of electricity to make people think there wasn't enough electricity to go around. Like that, it was like that crazy and messed up an organization. And you know, so this, when they fell and people found out all this horrible stuff about them, it was amazing. You know, people's just jaws dropped, and also they were such a public force that they had the naming rights to, I guess it's Minute Maid Field now. The Houston Astros Stadium used to be Enron Field. You know, so they were a real public, huge corporation, and when they fell, it was like, oh my God. You know, and so that really does then have, you know, at least theoretically, I don't think it did have as much of an effect on corporate culture as it might, right? Because we know that then 6 years later, you know, corporations hadn't gotten better. And I realize I've been blathering about Enron and we're at full time. I would just also say maybe I'll talk a little bit about the habitus next time, because that comes up in here with symbolic power, and I just want to make sure that you get a handle on that. But we do have to get going now, and so we'll talk about Ms. Rachi and company next time. And that is going to be, oh, that's me, because, right, that was, okay, yes. I'll be talking about Israel and Jordan and this national context around organizations. Okay, so have a good one. We'll see you later.